I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with section 11.9 from the Russian Cosmists, Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We're picking up at the beginning of chapter 9, The Scientific Cosmist. As we have seen, the religious cosmists did share a thematic thread that linked them to Fedorov and to each other. But when the term cosmist is mentioned, Solovyov, Bulgakov, Florensky, and Berdyaev are not the first names that come to mind. The names that do immediately come to mind are the scientific thinkers, especially Tsiolkovsky, Vernadsky, Chizevsky, and Kuprovich. In this chapter, we shall consider what these specialists from various disciplines have in common with Fedorov and with each other, and how they differ. Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky, 1857 to 1935. In the 1870s, while working in the library, Fedorov often went out of his way to serve a special group of ragged young scholars whom he liked to call his stipendiates. One of these was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, then a 16-year-old raw youth who had arrived in Moscow from a provincial village in 1873 with no money and no friends and only a minimal education. Nearly deaf from a childhood bout with scarlet fever, solitary, a daydreamer, caring little about appearance or conventions, the teenager was already on his way to becoming the Kaluga eccentric, Kaluziki Shudak, that would eventually become his nickname. As he later described himself, I often became shy and behaved awkwardly among other children my age and among people in general. My deafness due to my scarlet fever compelled me, however, to read and daydream endlessly. I felt isolated, even humiliated as an outcast from society. This caused me to withdraw deep within myself, to pursue great goals, so as to deserve the approval and respect of others and not be despised by my peers. His mother died when he was a child. His father, a forest worker, was away from home much of the time, and the village school could do little for a deaf and extraordinarily gifted child. So he had come to Moscow to learn, and in Fedorov he found his ideal teacher. He later told an interviewer how they first became acquainted. It happened on one of my first visits. I dropped in, and here's what I saw. A dozen or so people, mostly students, were crowding around the librarian. I was shy. I stood there waiting for the librarian to get free. I'd come to look him over, a bald head, a rounded white curls sprinkled with gray coal-black eyebrows and surprisingly young eyes. He looked about 50, but he had youthful movements, quick and sharp. When the last student had left, the librarian noticed me and mentioned for me to come to him. Apparently I looked nervous because he smiled encouragingly. If you could only have seen his smile. It changed him and brightened him up at once. It was so affable and open, the way a father smiles at a son, or one brother at another. But this was the first time he had seen me. I was immediately filled with affection for him, and having forgotten my earlier shyness, walked up to him. He carefully asked, "What do you want to read?" "Give me, if you can, the history of the Peasant War." "That book is forbidden." "Please speak a little louder, I don't hear well." "The book is forbidden." The words sounded so harsh as if to say, "See here now, with the kind of readers we have, give out forbidden books indeed." But his eyes were merry and smiling. Still, I hadn't been around people much and didn't know what to say. He went off somewhere, quickly returned, and handed me a book. I asked, "What's this?" "The History of the Peasant War." "But isn't this book forbidden?" "Take it." Tsiolkovsky tells us that he was soon visiting Fedorov every day, and joined an enchanted group of young people led by a certain Volodya, probably Vladimir Kozenikov, under Fedorov's spell. Each day, Fedorov brought the young scientist a fresh stack of books and often spent hours with him discussing his studies. And once, noticing that Tsiolkovsky's coat was too light for the cold weather, Fedorov said, "Let's go to the store and get you a new overcoat. I suddenly have some spare money." Tsiolkovsky tells us, "The library was my university." He adds, understanding my inclination toward mathematics, physics, and in part chemistry, he selected literature for me and directed my self-education. He taught me to use the catalog to draw up a prospectus, to extract from books what was foremost and basic. It is no exaggeration to say that for me he took the place of university professors, with whom I had no association. Oddly enough, however, in the interview, Tsiolkovsky says that he and Fedorov never discussed the idea of space travel. Instead, he wrote, "It seems to me that the first seeds of the idea were cast by the famous fantasy writer Jules Verne. He awakened my mind in this direction. Then the longings arose, followed by mental activities, which of course would have led to nothing had they not been encountered the aid of science. What is more, I have the feeling, probably erroneous, that the principal idea is in love for an eternal striving towards the sun, to release from the chains of gravitation, were almost inborn in my case. At any rate, I have a perfect recollection that my favorite dream from the earliest years of childhood, even before books, was a nebulous consciousness of a medium without gravity, where motion in all directions would be perfectly free, and where one could feel better than a bird in the air. Where these desires came from I cannot understand them even to this day. There weren't any fairy tales of this nature, yet I dimly believed and felt and desired precisely this medium, without the encumbrances of gravitation." But according to Peterson, as early as 1864, Fedorov had incorporated the idea of space travel into his resurrection project. How strange, then, that between 1873 and 1876, two of the few people in Russia who were able to take the idea of space travel seriously met almost every day and discussed ideas of all kinds, but supposedly did not once touch on the subject that set them apart from almost all their contemporaries. Yet when asked directly if they had discussed space travel, Tsiolkovsky answered no, and I very much regret it. How could this have happened? At that time I had youthful dreams about exploring interplanetary space, and tormented myself looking for a path to the stars, but didn't meet even one like-minded person. In the person of Fedorov, fate had sent me a person who thought as I did, that people would certainly master the cosmos. But by an irony of that same fate, I absolutely didn't know about Fedorov's views. We had many discussions on various topics, but somehow we avoided space. Probably our difference in age accounted for this. He apparently found that conversations about space with me would have been premature. But the literary critic and memoirist Viktor Shklovsky, who apparently asked Tsiolkovsky the same question, has written just the opposite. Both in his memoirs Once Upon a Time and in an article on cosmonautics for Literarная Gazeta, Shklovsky tells us, in his characteristically aphoristic way, that it was Fedorov who first encouraged Tsiolkovsky to develop his serious interest in space travel. There once was a man named Fedorov, a philosopher respected by Lev Tolstoy. He said that mankind would soon find the earth too crowded. And he said this is in the last century. He's the one who was Tsiolkovsky's teacher. Tsiolkovsky was deaf. He was deaf and he was studying in school. He was sitting in the then Chertkov library over books of mathematics. The old man Fedorov walked up behind him and started speaking. The mathematician didn't turn around. He was deaf. Then Fedorov wrote on paper, "I'm going to do mathematics with you, and you'll help mankind build rockets, so that we will finally be able to know more than the Earth, and so we can see our Earth." People need a distant view, because only those people who are thinking about the future are real and present. But whether he did or did not discuss space travel with Fedorov, Tsiolkovsky returned to his village to prepare for the qualifying examination for science teachers while daydreaming of interplanetary travel. He passed the exam in 1879 and began to teach in the town of Borovsk, where Fedorov had taught some 20 years before in the Kaluga region, not far from where Tsiolkovsky had grown up. And in that year, for his first teaching experience, he began to make notebooks, sketches for rocket boats, rocket wagons, and rocket-powered spaceships. Initially inspired, as he had said, by Fedorov's almost exact contemporary Jules Verne, he wrote narratives about traveling beyond Earth by rocket ship, exploring and colonizing first the solar system and then the entire cosmos. But what distinguished Tsiolkovsky's imagination from that of any of his contemporaries is that after writing fantasy narratives and drawing rough pencil sketches, he developed the mathematical formulas that would make the realization of some of his fantasies possible. Over the years, while still teaching school and working after hours in a homemade attic laboratory, he built a series of large wooden model rockets, dirigibles, aerostats, wind tunnels, centrifuges, and primitive space vehicles, and wrote the papers that would eventually lay the foundation for the 1957 launching of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. As a Soviet historian of science wrote, the works of Tsiolkovsky contain an embryo of nearly all the scientific technical attainments of the Soviet Union in the exploration of space. With amazing accuracy, he determined the path, stage by stage, of the development of engineering facilities for the solution of this problem. It's quite natural, therefore, that with each new development in this field, we recall Tsiolkovsky as a scientist who foresaw in one way or another the outcome of these events. And the American literary scholar and intellectual historian Michael Holquist concisely summarizes the international import of Tsiolkovsky's accomplishments. Tsiolkovsky was the first to do most of the things necessary to make, launch, and sustain life inside rockets as we now know them. The list of his original contributions is overwhelming. He developed aerodynamic test methods for rigid airframes. He solved the problem of rocket flight in a uniform field of gravitation. He calculated the amount of fuel needed to overcome the Earth's gravitational pull. He invented gyroscopic stabilization of rocket ships in space, and he discovered a method for cooling the combustion chamber with ingredients of the fuel itself, a method still widely used in most jet engines. In his autobiography, Tsiolkovsky would complain, not entirely accurately, that his groundbreaking papers were largely ignored by the Tsarist scientific establishment, and that it was only in Soviet times that his work was recognized. His earliest papers were published in respectable journals as early as 1898, and as a result he was awarded a modest government stipend for research and experiments between 1899 and 1903. Indeed, many of his most important discoveries were made during Tsarist times between 1890 and 1917. But it was only after the revolution that his work gained national and later international recognition. He complained in a diary that if a more famous scientist in Imperial Russia, such as Dmitry Mendeleev, had published these ideas on rocketry, they might have transferred abroad and translated into French or German much earlier. It's probably true that his curriculum vitae, as a self-educated eccentric schoolteacher working with wooden models in a homemade laboratory in Kaluga, did not qualify him to rank among the leading scientists of Imperial Russia, but his great accomplishments from humble beginnings made him an ideal model of the new Soviet intellectual worker, a democratic rocket scientist, a genius emerged from the proletariat. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the powerful Soviet propaganda machine turned the Kaluga eccentric, planning interdisciplinary expeditions while riding his bicycle along village dirt paths, into a national hero. So much so, in fact, that in post-Soviet times a moderate backlash has occurred, and a few critics have gone out of their way to try to prove him a mythologized mediocrity whose discoveries are overrated. Tsiolkovsky's reputation reached a peak on May Day 1935, when he was invited to address the nation by radio during the Grand Annual Parade. Due to ill health, he could not attend the ceremony in person, but a speech he recorded in his Kaluga laboratory was broadcast over all 9 Soviet time zones and from speakers atop the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square, with Stalin leading the applause. But as the biographer, James T. Andrews, has shown, the exploitation was mutual and Tsiolkovsky played the Soviet system as skillfully as it played him. Even though the Bolsheviks and Stalin used Tsiolkovsky for their own propaganda, he was also an agent of his own destiny. Much like other scientists, he worked the system for his own benefit as a conscious actor, constructing his own identity locally, nationally, and internationally. He also used the Soviet bureaucracy, popular publishers, and the Soviet press to popularize his ideas on spaceflight and rocketry. He therefore understood, as his own publicist, so to speak, how to manipulate a variety of venues to popularize the futuristic visions of human space travel. His great accomplishment as a scientist was not only to quantify the dream of space travel through mathematical equations, but to actively promote and popularize the idea of flight beyond Earth, to inspire an enthusiasm for rocket scientists among young people and even school children throughout the Soviet Union. He provided a kindly, grandfatherly, down-to-earth image for an otherwise daunting field of study. He popularized space exploration primarily by publishing, in addition to his technical papers, a number of long and short science fiction pieces, which, although not always impressive from a literary standpoint, drew many future Russian rocket scientists into the field. Generations of young readers were thrilled by the narratives of brave international teams of scientists, often a German, French, Chinese, and American scientist, led by a Russian, blasting off from Earth to explore and colonize the cosmos. Among those young readers who grew up to be outstanding scientists were members of the team that launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the cosmonaut and first man in space Yuri Gagarin, and the cosmist heliobiologist Alexander Zhizevsky, whose ideas we shall discuss later in this study. But it is not only rocket scientists who are interested in Tsiolkovsky. From earlier in his career until later in life, he speculated profusely about man's relationship to the cosmos. Some of these speculations found their way into his science fiction narratives. Others were published in tiny editions as discursive pamphlets or tracts, but most remained unpublished during his lifetime and have only begun to emerge since the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a result of these speculations, many of them Gnostic or theosophical in orientation, Tsiolkovsky had become something of a New Age cult figure in Russia, and his home and museum in Kaluga have become a destination for esoteric as well as scientific pilgrims. One of his central ideas has to do with the presence of life and spirit in all matter. He writes, "I am not only a materialist, but also a panpsychist, recognizing the sensitivity of the entire universe. I consider this characteristic inseparable from matter. Everything is alive, but with the condition that we consider living only that which possesses a sufficiently strong sense of feeling. Since everything that is matter can, under favorable circumstances, convert to an inorganic state, then we can conditionally say that inorganic matter is an embryo potentially living." An idea at the heart of most of his non-technical writings is that of the atom spirit, inherent in every particle of matter in the cosmos, recalling Fedorov's idea of all matter as the dust of ancestors. Tsiolkovsky's view of the cosmos is that it is teleological, rationally organized, and hierarchical. Lower life forms, consisting mainly of matter in which spirit is dormant, evolve into higher ones, in which the spirit is awakened and more dominant, and eventually as we approach perfection we will outgrow our material envelopes and join the rays of cosmic energy that constitute something like the pleroma of the Gnostics. The dark side of Tsiolkovsky's ideal of self-perfecting humanity is that it requires the elimination, the quote-unquote weeding out, of those of us who are in some way defective. Unlike Fedorov, whose future resurrection society must include absolutely everyone, Tsiolkovsky's future perfect society is highly selective. Losers of any kind will not make the cut. In articles titled Grief and Genius, Gori Geni, and the Genius Among the People, Geni Sredi Luyudi, Tsiolkovsky offers his variation on Plato's idea of the philosopher king, suggesting that scientific geniuses and inventors should occupy the key positions in future government, and that the many nations of the world should become a single cosmic political system governed by the most advanced and therefore most nearly perfect specimens of humanity. Like Fedorov and many esoteric writers before him, Tsiolkovsky considered the macrocosm and microcosm to be structured upon the same organic principles, and the perfection of the inner man and the outer world to be mutually interdependent. All the planets in our solar system, and indeed all material bodies and gaseous clouds in the cosmos, contain life in one form or another, and in one stage of development or another. Asteroids and moons, for example, may contain only the dormant seeds or embryonic forms of life, while other planets in or beyond our galaxy may be inhabited by life forms far more advanced than ours, life beyond the physical stage. Our Earth, Tsiolkovsky proposed, could merely represent one of the more primitive earlier steps in the self-perfecting development of life. We, however, are made of the same atom spirits as the ethereal beings, existing beyond our dimensions of recognized reality, so eventually, led by geniuses, we may attain the stages of life traditionally ascribed to Mahatmas, angels, demiurges, and other higher beings. Already, Tsiolkovsky believed, these higher beings are in communication with us, reading our thoughts and sending us messages through celestial symbols which most of us do not even perceive, much less understand. A genius is one who comprehends and channels these messages from higher beings into earthly projects. The poet who hears the muses, the inspired inventor who turns a dreamed universal symbol into a useful object. Tsiolkovsky's version of the metempsychosis proposes that our living atom spirit does not expire when our body dies, but continues, perhaps after a dormant interval, in some other physical or non-physical fresh being. We always have lived and always will live, but each time in a new form, and it goes without saying, with no memory of what came before. He writes that when most people hear this idea, they are unhappy. They immediately wish their new life to be a continuation of the previous one, to live again, even if in some other realm or on some other plane, with the family and friends they previously knew. Tsiolkovsky uses the analogy of a happy dream, to which we wish, after awakening, to return and continue. But just as each new happy dream in a night can be different, without reference to the previous ones, so each fresh life of our atom spirit will begin as a clean slate. In dying, one says farewell forever to one's circumstances. After all, they are in the brain, but the brain is decomposing. New circumstances will arise when the atom spirit finds itself in another brain. That new brain will provide circumstances, but different ones, having no connection to the previous ones. The ends and beginnings of atoms, of individuals, and of civilizations mirror the larger, longer processes of cosmic ends and beginning. The death and birth of planets, suns, and galaxies, while life itself, both macrocosmic and microcosmic, continues forever. In an article written near the end of his life, he summarizes his philosophy. A. Integral life is distributed throughout the universe. B. The most advanced development of life is not to be found on Earth. C. The mind and might of the leading planets are guiding the universe into a state of perfection. To put it succinctly, integral life with minor exceptions is mature, and therefore powerful and beautiful. D. This life for every being seems uninterrupted, since non-being is not experienced. E. Throughout the cosmos extend social organizations governed by a president of varying merit. One is higher than another, and in this way there is no fixed limit to personal or individual development. If every mature member of the cosmos is lofty beyond our understanding, then isn't the president of the first, second, 10th, or 100th rank also incomprehensible? F. The endlessness of past time compels us to propose the existence of still additional series of independent worlds of a lower order separated by eternities. These worlds, as they become complex, have left as residue a part of their matter and part of the animal life in a primitive state. From this is apparent the endless complexity of the manifestations of the cosmos, which of course we are not able to grasp in full measure, since it is even higher than we can imagine. According to how much the mind expands, knowledge may increase and reveal to it a universe that is greater and greater. Even to the admiring reader, Tsiolkovsky's grand vision of an ever-perfecting cosmos may sound less inspiring today than it did when it was written, given that the process of perfecting would require not simply a Fedorovian elimination of a resurrection person's individual imperfections, but the elimination of imperfect individuals themselves. Tsiolkovsky does not, of course, offer formulas or detailed plans for how those standing in the way of cosmic, quote, cleansing would be eliminated, but as leaving such details to future scientific geniuses may be less than universally reassuring. Nevertheless, for his combination of esoteric imagination and hard science, and by virtue of his image as a largely unpretentious self-made genius, Tsiolkovsky has become a leading icon of Russian Cosmism. Since 1967, the Tsiolkovsky State Museum of the History of Cosmonautics in Kaluga has conducted ongoing research and sponsored frequent conferences and seminars exploring all sides of its namesake's work and influence. Yuri Gagarin himself laid the cornerstones for the museum. A typical conference with participants from Russia, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the Americas now hosts at least 12 sections, which focus on such topics as Tsiolkovsky's scientific legacy, the history of rocketry and astronautics, technical problems of rocketry and spacecraft, the mechanics of space flight, the issues of space medicine and biology, aviation and aerostations, astronautics and philosophy, Tsiolkovsky's philosophy, Tsiolkovsky and scientific prognosis, Tsiolkovsky and issues of space vehicle production, Tsiolkovsky and issues of cosmonauts' professional activity, Tsiolkovsky and education, Tsiolkovsky and the economics of aeronautics. The papers presented at these conferences and later archived online are usually illuminating and of high academic quality. Under the rubric of Tsiolkovsky's philosophy, recent papers that have been particularly useful for the writing of this study include works on such topics as the concept of life in Tsiolkovsky's metaphysics, Gnostic ideas in Tsiolkovsky, the idea of social structure in Solovyov and Tsiolkovsky, Giordano Bruno and Tsiolkovsky, Tsiolkovsky's noospheric hierarchy, Tsiolkovsky's philosophy and the teachings of the Rorics, Tsiolkovsky on the coevolution of microworlds and megaworlds, and the problem of Tsiolkovsky's concept of the atom spirit. Tsiolkovsky's Kaluga, then, has become a mecca for cosmist research as well as for New Age pilgrimage. In most of the conferences, articles, and books that contribute to the thriving academic industry of cosmist studies in Russia, whether in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Krasnoyarsk, or Kaluga, Tsiolkovsky and Fedorov are considered two of the three central figures. The third, to whose thought we shall now turn, is Vladimir Vernadsky. Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, 1863 to 1945. Of the major cosmists, Vladimir Vernadsky is the most thoroughly academic in the best sense of that term. He inherited and passed on the next generation his family's tradition of intellectual achievement. His father, Ivan, was an active liberal professor of political economy and journal editor in Russia and the Ukraine. His son, George, a professor of history first in Russia, then in Czechoslovakia, and finally at Yale. Vladimir himself, while still a schoolboy, translated academic papers for his father's journal and began to publish his own scholarly works during the first years of university study. Growing up in a highly educated, cultured family environment, he read Darwin in English at age 17, Humboldt in German the following year, lectured and published in French at the Sorbonne, and eventually could read at least 15 languages, including ancient Greek, Latin, and the major modern Slavic, Romance, and Germanic languages. From his earlier school years, he led extracurricular discussion groups, read widely in history, philosophy, and world literature, and in the course of his long life, founded and directed new scientific disciplines and institutions in Russia and the Ukraine, both in Tsarist and Soviet times. though still not a household name in the West. He is considered by learned Russians to rank with the very greatest figures in the history of Western science. The editors of the volume Vernadsky, Pro et Contra, write, as time passes, Vernadsky's contribution to world science should by rights take an equal place with the legacy of such giants of the natural sciences as Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. Other 20th century Russian intellectuals have been equally laudatory. For example, in reply to a questionnaire for an academic science journal, the internationally honored literary critic and intellectual historian Dmitry Lakchayev wrote, V.I. Vernadsky, in my judgment, is the greatest scientist and thinker of the 20th century, the pride of Russian science. Throughout his life and career, Vernadsky stood for intellectual freedom and integrity against all contrary pressures, whether from Tsarist or Soviet sources. He stood for continuity rather than breaks with tradition, and for the highest rather than broadest intellectual and cultural standards. An exemplary liberal and for a while a prominent member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, he made no secret of his opposition to both Tsarist and Soviet repressive policies. Through the worst purges of the Stalinist era, he continued to write, both in private memoranda to communist officials and in published scientific papers, criticisms not only of classical Marxist but also contemporary Soviet tendencies affecting the natural sciences. A moderate among radicals of every tendency, he was arrested briefly but spared the harshest punishments, and was allowed to continue his scientific research primarily because his work in many fields, including atomic energy, was valuable to economic and military development. His patriotism was unquestionable, and his consistent philosophical opposition to classic dialectical materialism could be dismissed by ideological watchdogs as eccentric, harmless, mystical eyewash from an earlier era. Officially ignored as a thinker, but respected as an experimental scientist through the Soviet era, he has been venerated since the fall of the USSR, both as a creative scientific genius and as a thinker who prominently lived an honorable life through difficult times. Boldness, creativity, profundity, and most of all integrity marked his entire career. As a scientist, he is chiefly noted for his concept of the surface of the Earth as a biosphere evolving into a noosphere, from the Greek nous, mind, a sheath of life increasingly infused with and directed by the human mind. Vernadsky, of course, was not the first or only thinker to emphasize the human intellect's contribution to our planet's development. Even before Darwin in 1859, the Yale geologist James D. Dana, often cited by Vernadsky and later Cosmists, had developed the idea of cephalization, the evolution of living matter in a single headward direction. And another American geologist cited by Vernadsky, J. LeConte, had written about the Psychozoic era. Closer to Vernadsky's time, the Russian A.P. Pavlov was writing about the anthroposphere. P.A. Florensky, as we have noted, advanced the concept of a pneumatosphere, and Vernadsky's pupil A.E. Fersman wrote of the emerging technosphere. Even the terms biosphere and noosphere were not coined by Vernadsky. Biosphere was used early by the Australian geologist Edgar Soyce, and noosphere first appeared in publications by Vernadsky's French colleagues Teilhard de Chardin and Edouard Leroy, who had probably developed their concepts while attending Vernadsky's Sorbonne lectures. But it was Vernadsky who presented the fullest elaboration of these concepts, in a body of scientific and philosophical speculations that remain central to Russian cosmist thought today. As a historian of Russian science, Kendall Bales has noted, so much of Vernadsky's thought has now been accepted as axiomatic in natural science that it is difficult to appreciate how fresh and bold his ideas seemed when initially published. He was one of the first scientists to emphasize that the exchange of matter leads to a basic unity of the planet, its human inhabitants, and the cosmos. He demonstrated the role of living matter, humans, animals, and plants, in that transfer of solar energy into mineral matter, showing that life not only evolves from hard mineral matter, but in the process of disintegrating over eons, contributes to the creation of new matter. Vernadsky believed wrongly, according to most subsequent scientific opinion, that there has never been a time in the history of the universe where the Earth has been devoid of life. What we term inert matter, he argued, actually contains within itself the makings of life, even if in almost negligible quantities. Vernadsky rejects any separation of matter from spirit, but defines all present life as living matter, and holds that all presently non-living matter shares with all life a fundamental unity that includes the potential to change from inert to living matter, and from living matter back to inert. From being presently alive to being alive formerly, and once more alive in the future. A 20th century scientific analog to Pythagorean metempsychosis. Human beings, to Vernadsky, were first and foremost inhabitants of the planet, one component in a cycle of physical and chemical interactions and transmutations, and as such they possessed an obligation to think and act for the good of the planet, as well as for their own personal comfort and well-being. We are, in a very deep sense, related to all on our planet, to animals, vegetables, and minerals, as well as to other human beings, and as a rational component of the biosphere, we have responsibility, literally, to all. Vernadsky was not religious in any conventional sense, but he was a deeply spiritual thinker, well read in the literature of the world's religions, and in Eastern and Western philosophy. One of his closest lifelong friends was the noted Orientalist and specialist in Hindu thought and culture Sergei Oldenburg, with whom Vernadsky exchanged many long letters on fundamental questions of life and belief. Vernadsky recognized that a unified view of nature, the idea of the interconnectedness of all, has for millennia been at the heart of much religious and philosophical speculation, and so at the deepest level he found no moral conflict between scientific and spiritual views of the world. He noted that of all the world's religions he had studied, the one he felt closest to would be the ancient Greeks' hylozoistic pantheism of Thales, Anaximenes, and Heraclitus, which finds life to some degree present in all matter. Vernadsky looked at life and at humanity's role in life from the perspective of a geologist, taking the long view, seeing over eons of interchange and transformation, the migration of atoms and their particles within living matter and between living and inert matter. Living and writing through a period when science often had to conform to political ideology, the worst example being the Lysenko affair, in which politically correct anti-fascist research into seed grains led to disastrous harvests, many deaths, and the crippling of biological science for decades in the USSR. Vernadsky courageously spoke out for the independence of scientific investigation from all external political, religious, philosophical, and cultural constraints. For Vernadsky, if all intellectual activities in history, science alone could show definite proven progress over time, and is humanity's one irrefutable universal body of knowledge. While other disciplines moved this way or that, back and forth and sideways, cycling and recycling, only science demonstrably advanced, and only science could be understood and applied universally, beyond all differences in language, religion, politics, and culture. At the time Vernadsky was writing, overarching Marxist deterministic economic theory was supposed to be superior to all other intellectual disciplines. Every idea and every human action was assumed to be economic and class-based at root. Vernadsky insisted on the superiority of scientific knowledge, arrived at by empirical scientific methods. Free science, more than any other intellectual activity, could bring genuine benefit to human beings. As inhabitants first and foremost of the cosmos and the planet, Human beings owe allegiance to the biosphere more than to any nation, ethnic entity, economic class, or system. And running further against the grain of his times, Vernadsky insisted that outstanding individual minds contributed more of value to all humanity than any mass movements. Vernadsky drew upon and cited in his works advances contributed by individual scientists from many countries, including works by Germans when at that very moment Russia was at war with Germany. Though basically apolitical and internationalist in outlook, he was more drawn to socialist than to capitalist values, and as conditions grew more severe, he made a conscious decision to stay in Russia rather than emigrate with his son and family, who went to Czechoslovakia then to America. He saw himself as a patriotic Russian, loyal more to his people's cultural traditions than to the present government, and at the same time as a scientist working within a universal tradition that had begun thousands of years before and would continue thousands of years after him, one person who happened to be a Russian, contributing to the worldwide, even cosmic evolution of knowledge. For Vernadsky, the biosphere represents the planet's sheath of living matter, and the noosphere represents the biosphere's emerging sheath of thinking matter. Scientific knowledge is noospheric matter, and is emerging as a force that over time will have as much influence on the planet as life did with the emergence of the biosphere. In Vernadsky, all the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, geology, are interconnected, interrelated, and all are evolving together. Hence the new compound terms such as biogeochemistry for the fields of research that Vernadsky founded. Unlike Fedorov and some of the other cosmist thinkers, Vernadsky did not consider the development of the noosphere to be a task that humanity could choose to or fail to choose to undertake, but rather that the noosphere proceeds from the biosphere's natural cosmic evolutionary process, an inevitable development in which human reason gradually expands, fully obedient to rather than in opposition to the laws of nature. In Vernadsky's thought, life, along with matter and energy, is an external constant in the cosmos. Through many transformations and exchanges of form, life has always been and will always be. Among the new concepts and terms that Vernadsky introduced to science are the ubiquity of life, the pressure of life, the thickening of life, and the speed of life. Present in the thin or thick, fast or slowly interchanging concentrations throughout the cosmos, living matter exerts a pressure on inert matter at the atomic and subatomic level. Particles are exchanged, thin concentrations of living matter so thin in inert matter as to be almost non-existent, thicken under the pressure from exchanges with living matter. The speed of exchange increases, and in this way life as we know it emerges from matter that appears, but never entirely is, lifeless. As a scientific description of a cosmic unity that some religions and philosophies also posit, and which Alexander Chernyavsky would develop further, Vernadsky writes that the biosphere develops on Earth not only from planetary sources, but from solar and other cosmic forces beyond Earth. Cosmic forces outside in large measure shape the face of the Earth, and as a result the biosphere differs hypothetically from the other parts of the planet. We can gain insight into the biosphere only by considering the obvious bond that unites it to the entire cosmic mechanisms. The biosphere may be regarded as a region of transformers that convert cosmic radiation into active energy in electrical, chemical, mechanical, thermal, and other forms. Radiations from all stars enter the biosphere, but we catch and perceive only an insignificant part of the total. This comes almost exclusively from the sun. Biogenic migrations from beyond Earth contribute to the formation of Earth's atmosphere and play an integral role in the formation of the mineral deposits in the Earth's crust. Vernadsky, concurring with a strong tradition of Russian thought, holds that man is not, as he sometimes wrongly believes, a free and independent creature, separate from and above the kingdom of nature. In the intensity, complexity, and depth of modern life, man forgets in a practical sense that he himself and all humanity, from which he may not be separated, is inescapably linked with the biosphere. In reality, no one living organism finds itself in a free circumstance on Earth. All these organisms are constantly and inextricably linked. First of all, in their food and breathing, with the material energy environment around them. Outside of it, they cannot exist under natural conditions. For Vernadsky, science proves the organic cosmic wholeness that mystical poets and spiritual thinkers have traditionally intuited. Vernadsky foresaw the positive and negative potential in the development of atomic power. In an essay, A Few Words About the Noosphere, written in 1944, in a time of war near the end of his life, Vernadsky recognizes that with the splitting of the atom, a decisive moment would arrive, both in the course of the war and in the course of human history. In the geological history of the biosphere, a great future lies open to mankind, if he will accept it, and will not use his reasoning powers and his labor for self-destruction. During and just after World War I, Vernadsky had considered the Bolshevik Revolution, with its glorification of the uneducated masses and denigration of the cultivated individual, an unnatural phenomenon. Now at the height of World War II, he considers the racist ideology of German National Socialism to be equally unnatural and anti-scientific. A geologic evolutionary process is responsible for the biological unity and equality of all people. Homo sapien and his geological ancestors, Sinanthropus and others, whose descendants of the white, red, yellow, and black races, in whatever variations among them all, have enveloped ceaselessly in innumerable generations. Such is the law of nature. All races mix among themselves and produce fruitful progeny. In historical confrontations, for example in war of such scale as the present one, in the last analysis the victor will be the one who follows this law. One cannot act with impunity against the principle of the unity of all peoples, as one cannot act against the law of nature. And just as World War I brought both a violent end to the old social order and inevitable change to the biosphere, the war will coincide with a new inevitable era for Earth. The emergence of the noosphere, which, despite all peril associated with the war, Vernadsky views with a degree of optimism. The noosphere is a new geological phenomenon on our planet. In it, for the first time, mankind becomes a major geological force. Mankind can and must transform his habitat by his labor and thought, transforms it radically in comparison to its previous state. Before mankind, wider and wider creative possibilities are opening, and perhaps my grandchild's generation will glimpse their flourishing. The noosphere is the latest of many stages of biological evolution in geological history, the stage of our days. The course of this progress is only beginning to become clear to us from a study of the geological past in certain of its aspects. It's sometimes pointed out that Vernadsky's concept of the noosphere is in some way similar to the theosophical and anthroposophical idea of Akasha, the Sanskrit term for ether, a fifth element beyond the fire, air, earth, and water, a non-material realm in which all human thoughts and memories are recorded, constantly updated, and preserved. In theosophical literature, advanced adepts may read the Akashic record clairvoyantly, or during the out-of-body experience of astral travel. Noted clairvoyants who have reported for the rest of us their readings from the Akashic record include the British theosophist Charles Ledbetter, the founder of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, and the American seer Edgar Cayce. A major difference between these two ideas is that Akasha is assumed to have existed from time immemorial, whereas we are just now in the process of creating the noosphere. Vernadsky recounts that 2 billion years ago, plants contained calcium emerging from the world of minerals, and then 500 million years ago, animals with calcium skeletons began to emerge. This development of calcium within living matter was, Vernadsky believes, one of the major stages in the geological history of the biosphere. Although the dates he assigns to some events might now be questioned, Vernadsky argues that the appearance of green forest 70 to 110 million years ago was another major stage in evolution, analogous to today's emergence of the noosphere. In the forest, human beings appeared 15 to 20 million years ago. Now, as a new geological stage is appearing, just in the most perilous of times, what is important for us is the fact that the ideals of our democracy move in unison with the elemental geological process from the laws of nature, which with responsibilities in the noosphere. Therefore, it is possible to view our future confidently. It's in our hands. We will not let it fall. Though certainly not a political activist, Vernadsky did believe that moderately socialistic democratic political ideas were, like scientific knowledge, part of noospheric content and would guide humanity in the biosphere in gradual but inevitable evolution in accordance with the laws of nature. Like Fedorov, Vernadsky was convinced that one of the steps in man's eventual evolution would take him through an autotrophic stage. The depletion of resources in the biosphere will not permit humanity to continue to live as it now lives, and at some point in the future, humanity will have to change itself radically or perish in a much degraded biosphere. The solution is through a science much advanced over today's, involving the ability to alter the physical and chemical makeup of human constitution so that humans can be transformed into heterotrophic to autotrophic beings, subsisting as some plants and bacteria now do, on air and sunlight instead of on other living matter. As soon as it can be discovered, the direct synthesis of food, without the intermediary of organic substances, will in a radical manner alter the future of mankind. Discoveries of this synthetic process are awaited, and great consequences for life will not be slow in coming. It is now difficult, perhaps even impossible, for us to imagine the geological consequences of this event, but it is evident that this will be a crowning achievement of paleontological evolution. It will not be an act of free human will, but a manifestation of a natural process. Human reason by this means would not only accomplish a new great social achievement, but would introduce into the mechanism of the biosphere a great new geological phenomenon. In the last analysis, the future of mankind will always be in large measure to be created by mankind himself. The creation of a new autotrophic existence will give him the possibility, so far lacking, to fulfill his age-old spiritual yearnings. It will in reality open before him the path to a better life. Honored in his own day as a brilliant experimental scientist, Vernadsky has in recent years, with the publication of many manuscripts kept in the drawer during Soviet times, gained iconic status as a scientific thinker, a pioneer environmentalist, and a model of integrity, dignity, and rectitude, consistently exhibited in a time and place where such qualities in prominent individuals were in short supply. He is a figure revered in cosmist studies in Russia today, and one hopes he might eventually be equally honored elsewhere. Alexander Leonidovich Chizevsky, 1897 to 1964. Like many other Russian cosmists, Alexander Chizevsky began life as a child prodigy, sickly but extraordinarily bright, talented and sensitive, privately educated at his family's country estate. Both as a child and as an adult, he was noted not only for his many-sided interests and talents, but also for an exceptional sensitivity to the physical, social, and spiritual environment. He was said to have a heightened ability to anticipate changes in the weather, unseen vibrations, fluctuations in the natural and social atmosphere. In his autobiography, he speaks of a constant, lifelong sensation of fever, of burning, as if of an inner sun, which he directed outward in a never-ending passion to learn and absorb all. His life's work, perhaps not accidentally, would be the study of solar and other cosmic influences on human behavior. Alexander's father, Leonid Chizevsky, was a well-educated military officer from an old aristocratic family. His mother died young, but the aunt and grandmother who took over his upbringing encouraged his precocity in music, poetry, and painting, activities which he continued through life. Alexander's father, very devoted to his young wife, did not remarry after her death, but dedicated all his energies outside military matters to his only son's education, providing him from a very early age with his own miniature laboratory for experiments in physics and chemistry. Every year until he was 10, the family took young Alexander abroad to the milder climates of France and Italy, where his health improved, he learned new languages, and he gained a broader, sunnier perspective on life. Later, with friends, he undertook archaeological investigations in Greece and Egypt, and for some years studied paintings in the academy in Paris under an instructor said to be a follower of Edward Degas. In World War I, he served with his father's regiment in Galicia, was awarded a George Cross for bravery, and after a serious wound accepted a discharge to resume his studies. Surprisingly perhaps for a future though unsuccessful Nobel nominee in chemistry, Chizevsky's first academic degree was in the humanities. His master's thesis was titled 18th Century Russian Lyric Poetry, and his first teaching position was on the faculty of the History and Philology department at Moscow University. But while teaching subjects in the humanities, he also audited courses on statistics at the business school and on chemistry, physics, biology, and astronomy in the Department of Natural Sciences. He would eventually publish a collection of poems praised by literary contemporaries, and would produce hundreds of accomplished impressionist oil paintings, watercolors, and pastels, but the works that would earn him an international reputation, like Florensky, as another Da Vinci of the 20th century, were his discoveries in Aryanization, heliobiology, and hemodynamics. His discoveries in aryanization, which led to effective air purification devices, such as the so-called Chizevsky chandelier, and in hemodynamics, which shed new light on the cycling of blood through living bodies, some first published in French, others in Russian, fell within the limits of acceptable Soviet science and earned Chizevsky high national and international honors. But his other important work in heliobiology, demonstrating the effects of solar pulsations on human life, aroused great controversy and provoked the accusations of mysticism, occultism, and general irrationality. Eventually, during the Stalinist terror, these accusations led to his arrest as an enemy under the mask of a scientist, resulting in 16 years in prison camps and exile, from 1942 until his rehabilitation into 1958. During imprisonment, despite special punishment for refusing to wear a large prison number on his back and for objecting to being addressed in the familiar second-person singular, he still painted, wrote poetry, and with whatever means he could find, continued to conduct scientific research. At one point, realizing that they had an internationally famous biologist in their hands, prison authorities dragged Chizevsky barely alive from a punishment cell to see if he could help stop a cholera epidemic that was sweeping the camp, which, with bleaching powder and other crude remedies at hand, he managed to do. As a reward, he was allowed to set up a minimal laboratory in the prison clinic, in which, using only a borrowed microscope and glass capillaries, he conducted groundbreaking investigations into the movement of blood that would later, after his rehabilitation, win public accolades from the President of the Academy of the Sciences of the USSR. He first outlined his thoughts about the influence of solar and other cosmic forces upon human behavior and history in his 1918 doctoral dissertation, Analysis of Periodicity in the Worldwide Process, which was published a few years later as Physical Factors of the Historical Process. Here, as thought out his scientific publications, Chizevsky writes as a confirmed determinist. He finds that all human psychical activity, indeed all that we think of as the sphere of intellect, culture, and history, consists essentially of physicochemical neurological interactions and lies in the domain of ordinary natural phenomena. Further, as natural phenomena, all intellectual and social activities are affected by interactions with their natural surroundings, including powerful geophysical and cosmic forces. As human beings, with only 5 senses and other limitations, even when aided by mechanical devices, we are aware of only a very small fraction of the innumerable rays, waves, particles, forces, and bundles of energy that constantly bombard our planet and us. Forces from both within our solar system and beyond not only our solar system, but even our galaxy. According to Shizevsky, these waves and particles of energy come at us in regular measurable patterns and periodicity, in cycles and rhythms of which we may not be conscious, but which lend order, rhythm, and cycles of periodicity to our lives. In an image that Shizevsky likes to repeat, our blood flows with the veins of the cosmos, and our heart beats with the pulse of the cosmos. The extent to which Shizevsky discovered cosmic influences on human events understandably struck the ideological watchdogs for Soviet scientists as blatant heresy. The proposition that it was not only great comrades Lenin and Stalin, the working classes, and historical necessity, but also sunspots and invisible cosmic rays that brought on the Great October Revolution, makes it a wonder that Shizevsky remained free until 1942. It's no accident that, in his almost mystical, if deterministic sense of the living cosmos, Shizevsky sounds more than a bit like Tsiolkovsky. For just as in the 1870s, Fedorov served as mentor to the 16-year-old Tsiolkovsky, so in 1914, Tsiolkovsky began to serve as mentor to the 17-year-old Shizevsky. In 1913, Shizevsky's father was assigned to head an artillery regiment in Kaluga, where young Alexander, continuing to experiment in his miniature laboratory, soon made the acquaintance of his fellow town genius, the Kaluga eccentric. In a memoir written near the end of his life, Shizevsky reminisced, "In my heart, Konstantin Eduardovich occupies a special place. We spent a great deal of time together. I remember his enormous erudition in the most diverse fields of science, and his exceptional breadth as a human being. He often expressed thoughts absolutely out of the ordinary and unexpected, about the cosmos, about the future of mankind, thoughts about which you couldn't read or hear anywhere else. Yes, and associations with him brought radical changes to my understanding of the world. With the aid of specific examples, he led me to think about the need for great changes in mathematics and physics, so vital for scientific work in the national sciences. Good advice from Konstantin Eduardovich was of great use to me at the time." Early commentators on Shizevsky's thought tended to view him primarily as a disciple and a younger colleague of Tsiolkovsky. But while they share many assumptions and conclusions, they also display significant differences. Tsiolkovsky provided needed public support from a well-established figure for an early, heavily criticized publication by Shizevsky, and in return Shizevsky, after establishing an international reputation of his own, contributed the preface to one of Tsiolkovsky's major books on rocketry. But Shizevsky had little to contribute to Tsiolkovsky's emphasis on how we can affect the cosmos, and neither Tsiolkovsky nor any of the other cosmists shared Shizevsky's emphasis on how the cosmos affects us. In contrast to all the other cosmists, who highlight the active role human beings take in universal processes, including human evolution, Shizevsky explores humanity's passive role as a receiver of cosmic influences and as a subject of cosmic laws of nature. In general, Shizevsky's work can be seen as an attempt to discover and define a single governing principle for the entire cosmos, an early 20th century Russian equivalent to Ken Wilber's theory of everything or Stephen Hawking's M theory. For Shizevsky, the principle behind everything, including human culture and history, is electronicity, the power of electrons to attract, combine, and form larger units of matter and energy. Gravity, magnetism, space-time, and matter-energy are all fundamentally electronic phenomena. The sun's influence on the biosphere, including on human behavior, is a matter of the transfer of electrons. In the 20th century, Shizevsky argues physics, chemistry, and astronomy have begun to coalesce into a single science of matter, and the social sciences and humanities have begun coalescing into different science of human culture. Shizevsky believes that the great scientific task for him and others now is to unite the science of matter and the science of human culture into a single science of everything, the examination and quantification of the one principle that governs all living and non-living phenomena in the cosmos, the discovery that patterns of solar activity sunstorms, sunspots, etc., coincide with patterns of mass human behavior, wars, revolutions, epidemics, etc., represents for Krzyzewski a large first step toward uniting the two separate great branches of knowledge. Krzyzewski also believed that the study of cosmic energy patterns could have useful predictive value. Knowing that a period of mass human excitability is approaching might allow wise leaders to direct that excitability into productive rather than destructive channels, into grand constructive projects and mass movements for the benefit of humanity, modern equivalents to pyramid building, instead of riots and wars. His studies in aeroionization led directly to purer air in factories and poultry barns, resulting in more productive workers, whether clothed or feathered. He hoped that someday applications from his work in heliobiology would prove equally useful to Soviet society and humanity in general. A convenient summary of his basic idea accompanied his 1922 work, Physical Factors of the Historical Process. He tells us that since 1915 he has engaged in research to investigate whether or not there existed a correlation between the more important phenomena of nature and events in the social historical life of mankind. In Physical Factors, he presents his findings on the connection between sunspot activity and both human mass behavior and the universal historical process. The facts he presents here are, he says, based upon statistics gathered by me while submitted to a minute scrutiny the history of all the peoples and states known to science, beginning with the 5th century BC and ending with the present day. A problem that immediately comes to mind is how anyone can direct minute scrutiny toward all the people and states known to science, from ancient times to the present. In the first place, science still knows almost nothing except the names of most people and states of remote eras, and even what is assumed to be known can change from generation to generation. Earlier science, for example, portrayed the Mayans as wise, happy, non-violent agrarian predecessors of the bloodthirsty Aztecs, until later scientists discovered all the horrible evidence of Mayan atrocities. And how do we scrutinize the Toltecs and the Zapotecs, or the many important peoples and states described by Herodotus, the Sarmatians, Massagetæ, Alans, Medes, and the like, who today knows any more about them than the colorful but questionable information provided by a writer known as both the father of history and the father of lies? Or the many biblical kingdoms, like the Amalekites, Jebusites, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, and their successors. All we know is their names and that they were enemies of ancient Israel. And in the case of more recent peoples and states, about which information is plentiful, the more minute the scrutiny, the messier the picture gets, and the more difficult an event or movement becomes to classify and quantify. For example, would the French Revolution be classified a peak of mass liberation, or, as Fedorov argued, a trough of irresponsibility? Nuanced historiography can deal with such questions, but can graphs and charts? Krzyzewski writes, as soon as the sunspot activity approaches its maximum, the number of important mass historical events taken as a whole increases, approaching its maximum during the sunspot maximum and decreasing to its minimum during the epochs of the sunspot minimum. Again, this presents some difficulties, especially in deciding what constitutes a mass historical event in ancient times. Would the Peloponnesian War qualify as a mass event? Or was it a local skirmish largely ignored in China, Ethiopia, Peru, and everywhere else outside the Aegean Basin? Are mass historical events confined to those people fortunate to have lived in a time and place of good chroniclers, decipherable languages, and durable surfaces to write on? In ancient Africa, who knows what unrecorded mass historical events may have occurred from time to time? And in well-recorded modern times, if during a given year of maximum or minimum sunspot activity, peace and plenty prevail here, while violent uprisings are taking place there, which one do we put on the chart? Krzyzewski continues, in each century, the rise of the synchronic universal military and political activity on the whole of the Earth's territory is observed exactly 9 times. This circumstance enables us to reckon that a cycle of universal human activity embraces 11 years in the arithmetical mean. Again, we have the same questions. What counts and what does not count as universal military and political activity? What about wars, violent uprisings, and vicious suppressions of political activity in times and places where such things go unrecorded? In earlier centuries, if only 4 or 5 such rises in excitability have made it into the literary records, what events do we add to get to 9? And more recently, how do we interpret our data if more than 9 surges of political and military activity are recorded in one century, especially if surges 9, 10, and 11 seem almost equally powerful? And what do we say when some of the most important surges occur in years with minimal solar activity? And what if we know the century, or perhaps even the decade in which something important happened, but not the exact year? We know, for example, that the Great Mughal movement into India occurred over the course of the 16th century, but even if we say it began under Babur between 1519 and 1530, how can we determine whether the maximum excitability for this movement did or did not occur during the solar eruption of 1528? Chevsky divides each 11-year cycle occurring 9 times each century into 4 parts or periods. 1. Minimum of excitability, 3 years. 2. Growth of excitability, 2 years. 3. Maximum of excitability, 3 years. And 4. Decline of excitability, 3 years. He finds from statistical analysis the number of historical events in the mean in each cycle falls into a pattern, at least for the 500 years from the 15th through the 20th centuries. For this point, he does not pretend to have sufficient data for earlier centuries. In period 1 of the minimum, 5% of the century's important historical events. Period 2, growth 20%. 3, maximum 60%. And 4, decline 15%. From all his data, he derives what he calls a law of historical process. The course of the universal historical process is composed of an uninterrupted row of cycles, occupying a period equaling in the arithmetical mean 11 years, and synchronizing in the degree of its military political activity with the sunspot activity. And he attributes certain historio-psychological peculiarities to each cycle. In the middle points of each cycle, provided economic, political, or military conditions are ripe, the mass activity of humanity all over the surface of the earth reaches maximum tension, manifesting itself in psychomotric pandemics, revolutions, insurrections, expeditions, migrations, etc., creating new formations in the existence of separate states and new historical epochs in the life of humanity. In these middle periods, majorities tend to exert power. At the extreme ends of every cycle, the tension of the all-human military political activity falls to the minimum, ceding the way to creative activity, and is accompanied by a general decrease of military or political enthusiasm, by peaceful creative work in the sphere of state organizations, international relations, science, and art, with a pronounced tendency towards absolutism in the governing powers and disintegration of the masses. Thus, in Chizevsky's theory, it is during periods of maximum solar activity each century that new political and religious doctrines appear. Heresies, religious riots, and pilgrimages spread, great social, military, religious leaders and reformists arise, corporations, associations, unions, leagues, sects, and powerful companies form, and frequently enough to be included, pathological epidemics and natural disasters coincide with maximum solar activity. Chizevsky, if not all who encounter his theory, can confidently conclude, thus, the existence of a dependence between the sunspot activity and the behavior of humanity should be considered established. He calls the new science historiometry, and supports his narrative with a number of charts and graphs, all now available on the internet, in which the peaks and valleys of solar and human activity turn out to be almost too nearly identical. The problem, as suggested above, lies in what data Chizevsky selects for his definition of universal human military political activity. As a general theory, it does seem plausible that cosmic forces of which we are only partly aware influence both individual and mass activities in ways we do not yet understand. For thousands of years, many human traditions, with the exception of our relatively recent rationalist tradition, have accepted such influences as self-evident. For me, the problem with historiometry lies more in the details than in the general thrust, more in the effort to offer quantitative proof instead of nuanced narrative. The data that Chizevsky would need for convincing proof of his argument does not need, and will not ever exist. Who can now say exactly when the Mongol expansions under Genghis Khan, a mass political military movement if there ever was one, displayed their peak of excitability? How universal is the universal process? The moving spotlight of history is too narrow in scope to illuminate all the dark places and times when important activities may have occurred, and too dim to adequately illuminate even those times and places it hovers over. If we look at our own recent past and recall events with which we may be most familiar, we can see that Chizhevsky's theory scores some hits on periods of maximum solar activity, but is less impressive on the minimums. Solar cycle 20 in NASA's table of cycles from 1755 to the present, for example, began in 1964, reached its maximum in 1968, and ended in 1976. This period very conveniently coincides with the crescendo and diminuendo of the nearly worldwide mass activism we think of as the 60s. The early build-up with new hair, new clothing, new music, and peaceful civil rights marches, culminating in a period of excitability in 1967 to 1969 with the Summer of Love, the Six-Day War, the Biafran War, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Prague Spring, and the invasion that crushed it, the Tet Offensive, violent youth protests in Paris and Chicago, the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the Manson murders, the moon landing, and so many other important events from the year 1968, extended a bit on each side, has been labeled the year that changed everything. Other solar cycles, such as solar cycle 23, beginning in 1996, ending in 2008, and reaching its maximum in 2000, offer the theory mixed success. Although on July 14, 2000, a powerful solar flare caused a major geomagnetic storm nicknamed the Bastille Day event, the year 2000 was relatively calm and did not experience any of the doomsday events predicted for the coming of the new millennium. The major event that occurred within the 3-year middle period of maximum excitability was, of course, the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. This, however, was more of a trigger for subsequent mass political military activity than an insistence of mass action itself. Cycle 24, which started in 2008 and is peaking in 2011, has already, in the so-called Arab Spring, displayed obvious examples of the psychomotoric pandemics that Chizhevsky finds characteristic of the middles of cycles. If it continues as it has started, the cycle of historic eruptions now peaking in 2011 could match the one that peaked in 1968. In examples such as Cycle 20 and Cycle 24, when parallels between solar and human activity are found to occur, it would seem that Chizhevsky's theory may have something to it. But too many great events occur without sunspot activity, and too many periods of maximum sunspot activity are not accompanied by major historical events to make the theory much more than interesting imaginative speculation. Much more work would need to be done to make Chizhevsky's detailed theory more credible than those derived from close readings of the Book of Revelation, the predictions of Nostradamus, or forecasts from the Mayan Codex. During his career, Chizhevsky was at times accused of trying to take human knowledge back to a pre-scientific state, for attempting to replace chemistry with alchemy, astronomy with astrology. Chizhevsky strongly denied these allegations, but added that he did respect and did wish to restore to modern science not the actual practices of alchemy and astrology, but the intuition underlying those pre-scientific efforts, that in some very profound and mysterious but eventually definable way, we and all matter in the cosmos are one, and that through exchanges of energies and matter via particles and rays, transformations between elements, cosmic and ours, can result. And he was always careful to point out that he was not arguing that solar eruptions cause wars and revolutions, or that periods of solar calm cause peace and goodwill on Earth, but that solar and cosmic energies do contribute to and perhaps even trigger events that other factors have been leading toward. He certainly did not solve all the problems he posed, and historiometry has not become a mainstream science. But Chizhevsky paid with 16 years of his life in prison for his efforts to establish a direction and an agenda that at least a few scientists in Russia, in research conferences and Kaluga, if not elsewhere, have, with amendments and cautions, begun to follow. Vasily Feofilovich Kuperovich, 1897 to 1969. The future great botanist, naturalist, and proponent of unlimited longevity, Vasily Kuperovich, was born in Kleniki, a village in the Smilavichi region of what is now Belarus. In order to support his 4 children, Vasily's father, Feofil, moved the family to the eastern Belarus town of Orsha, where he took a position as forester on the estate of a certain Count Lubinsky. There, in the forests and fields of the estate, young Vasily developed his lifelong love of nature, surprising grown-ups with his ability to remember the names and healing properties of so many of the plants in the vicinity. He began his education at the local Zemstvo school for peasant and working-class children. At age 16, went to Petersburg for naval cadet school, then underwent 2 years of officer training, after which he served in the Baltic on the destroyer Samson until he was wounded and demobilized in 1918. Kuprevich served as a village school teacher for some years, studied science on his own, and began to publish papers based on the independent research. In 1931, he graduated from the People's Institute for Advanced Training in Moscow, an institution specifically set up to develop talent from the working classes. And in 1934, he took a position at the Belarusian Academy of Sciences Institute for the Biological Sciences. In 1938, he became head of one of the laboratories of the Academy of Sciences, Botanical Institute in Leningrad, and from 1949 to 1952 served as director of the institute itself. In 1952, he returned to Byelorussia to serve as president of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, a position he occupied until his death in 1969. As a gifted and not terribly controversial botanist, he made important contributions to the understanding of processes of photosynthesis. He proved the possibility of heterotrophic nutrient of higher plants under natural conditions, and demonstrated the possibility of using the activity of certain enzymes as an indicator of biological activity in soil. He produced definitive taxonomic studies of fungi and catalogs of mushrooms, and investigated the healing properties of plants. Later in his career, he turned to the more controversial study of aging in plants, animals, and humans, and essentially introduced the science of gerontology to the USSR. For his scientific accomplishments in established fields, he won drawers full of awards and medals, and today's laboratories, institutes, and streets bear his name throughout Belarus. As a cosmist thinker, he has become best known since the end of the USSR for his pioneering contributions to the field of scientific immortalism, for his Fedorovian contention that death is not necessary, and that someday, relatively soon, perhaps within the 21st century, science will discover the means to prolong life indefinitely. Kuprevich updates Fedorov to hold that death is not permanently inherent in nature, but is a temporary adaptation to facilitate the process of evolution. Old forms of life must die so that new forms may arise. But with the development of the noosphere, humanity has evolved to the point that death is no longer needed for future evolution. Human reason, not biological necessity, will shape the future of humanity. The great obstacle to overcoming death is not physical, but intellectual and emotional. We now simply assume that the elimination of death is one of those things that cannot be done. But Kuprevich reminds us major scientific and technological advances have previously nearly always belonged to the category cannot be done. Like Fedorov before him, Kuprevich contends that the first step to indefinite longevity must be a change in attitude and orientation, that scientists and other leading intellectuals must rediscover a truth long contained in myth, legend, and popular religion, that people can live a very long time, and even Methuselah's 900 years need not be an ultimate limit. Death is against human nature. People embodied the dream of eternal life in myths about the immortal gods. Probably man intuitively understood that ages of ongoing evolution would be wasted if one could live only 50 to 70 years. The church promised man immortality up there in heaven. Then philosophers convinced him that to live means to be dying all the time, and the dream of a very long life, that's metaphysics. Kuprevich's investigations into the process of aging in plants proved to his satisfaction that in nature there is no permanently fixed human lifespan, no prohibition against extreme longevity, no reason why we cannot live as long as the universe itself. As Kuprevich puts it, having invented death, nature should also show us how to combat it. A basic mechanism in life, Kuprevich submits, is the ability of an organism to repair and renew itself. In humans, this ability continues through much of life in some parts of the body, e.g. fingernails, skin, liver, but not for the body as a whole. The task for science is to discover why this happens and how the process of self-renewal can be universalized and extended indefinitely. Organisms lost the ability to renew worn-out cells not because in their nature they are unable to reproduce without limit. This ability was simply lost as a result of natural selection, and the life of a hypothetically immortal individual then shortened a span whose length was no longer of use to the species. In his researches, Kuprovich found fossils of poplar trees from the Cretaceous period that were practically indistinguishable from those of the present day, meaning that for over 70 to 80 million years, from generation to generation, an individual poplar had passed on traces of its ancestors. Kuprovich notes that there are also individual specimens of certain woody plants that have aged of 10 to 12,000 years. We are talking about a span of life over the course of which mountains have collapsed, rivers have changed course or disappeared, civilizations have risen and fallen, the climate of large regions has changed more than once, and the configuration of continents has changed. Meanwhile, a thing, an individual, has continued to live, spreading around its offspring, increasing its own mass. There's nothing in the world of material structure that can compare in hardiness and durability with a protoplast, the bearer of life. In the animal kingdom, the span of life has evolved to its present length simply to accommodate the individual's need to reproduce itself and to nurture offspring to the point where they can survive on their own. Once the time required for the continuation of the genetic line has been reached, the individual begins its sudden or gradual decline toward death. As humans, we inherited from our ancestral primates a lifespan that meets biological requirements, but we differ from the rest of nature by being more than biological creatures. Like Fedorov, Kuprovich believes that our intellectual, emotional, and social evolution marks us for a special purpose in the cosmos, and that through our noospheric endeavors we may free ourselves from our inherited biological limitations. Kuprovich says that he does not necessarily give credence to legends of ancient, even prehistoric animals still alive today in various lakes and lochs around the world, but he finds nothing in nature that would absolutely preclude the survival of our time of an animal from a previous geological age. Kuprovich does not endorse the existence of Nessies, Yetis, or other cryptozoological phenomenon, but neither does he reject them out of hand. Here, like other cosmists, he urges readers to keep an open mind and accept that some truth may yet be found in disciplines and investigations thoroughly rejected by mainstream science. Kuprovich suggests that the campaign against death cannot simply be waged by medical science, which might postpone an individual's death for a few years or even decades, but should be waged through genetics, by isolating and eliminating the genes that mark us for aging and death. He suggests that in our search for the elixir of immortality, we should look not just to myth and legend, but to nature itself. One leading theory of aging holds that decline and death result from some genetic defect that leads us to a failure in the cell's process of self-renewal. But Kuprovich tells us geneticists have found that in certain cases a father and a mother with genetic defects produce an embryo without those defects, showing that nature through its process of reproduction is sometimes able to eliminate a defective genetic element. It's possible that similar paths can be found to eliminate the defects that occur in the elements of cells in the process of self-renewal. The task for future gerontology is to discover what aging human old age actually is. If it's a disease, then it can be cured. If it's programmed in a gene, then the program needs to be changed. A major problem, Kuprovich emphasizes, is in the way biology is taught and conducted today. He reminds us, and particularly as Soviet readers, that Marx left us a great principle: question everything. In the realm of science, it is from time to time essential to question absolutely everything, particularly everything that is universally considered to be natural and obvious. If we accepted what seemed most natural, obvious, and evident to all eyes, we would still believe that the sun goes around the earth every day. He suggests that the same is true of the natural and obvious fact that we may live, on average, approximately 70 years, and then we must die. Like most other cosmists before him, Kuprovich has accused during his lifetime of abandoning genuine science for pseudoscience, in his case attempting to revive the medieval alchemical search for the fountain of youth or elixir of life. But like Vernadsky, Tsiolkovsky, and Tchaikovsky before him, Kuprovich refused to allow his scientific researches to be limited to directions his predecessors and contemporaries had already established as safe to follow. As one of the best models for scientific cosmism, he let imagination and intuition prompt but not misdirect his empirical investigation. Today in Russia, Kuprevich's works are most frequently cited by scientists working in the immortalist branch of Cosmism. In communication with Western researchers in transhumanism and cryonics, the Russian immortalists define their field as a philosophical tendency which includes within itself 1. Through natural science, the investigation of the possibility of the radical extension of human life until the attainment of physical immortality. 2. A search for optimal socioeconomic models for the organization of a society consisting of immortal individuals. 3. A worldview for people who want to be physically immortal, and who believe that it's achievable by scientific means and that immortality is a boon to mankind. The immortalist movement today attempts to offer a deliberate synthesis of biological and sociological research. In previous times, evolution was viewed primarily as a biological phenomenon, dominated by the striving for survival by means of reproduction, and the preconscious psyche primarily served the aims of reproduction. With the emergence of the noosphere, immortalists contend, other factors begin to dominate, paving the way for Homo immortalis. Evolution of the psyche led to the emergence of consciousness, which allows the psyche to model itself, allows it to become conscious of itself, so that in addition to the purposes of reproduction, there arises an awareness of the existence of the self-worth of the individual consciousness and its carrier, and as a consequence, a striving for immortality. For the immortalist, the best use of the mind is the imaging of the ideal, immortal worlds, and the best society is that which tries to embody those ideal, immortal worlds. Freedom for the immortalist includes freedom from time, attaining a state in which time no longer dictates our actions. Practical immortality. With these and other ideas, today's Russian scientific immortalists and other cosmists extend concepts from Fedorov, Tsiolkovsky, Vernadsky, Shevetsky, and especially Krupevich to address 21st century scientific concern. As we shall see in the next chapter, cosmist ideas have also had a significant impact on certain general facets of Russian cultural life. Thus concludes Section 11.9 of the Russian Cosmists by George Young. Join us next time when we will begin 11.10, which is Chapter 10. We will see you then. Alam.